The baby in the homeless woman's arms had a crescent-shaped birthmark on her tiny wrist. Antoine's heart stopped. He'd seen that mark before, on his wife's wrist. But that was impossible. His daughter was dead. He'd buried her 6 months ago. So whose child was this? And why did she have his wife's birthmark? The rain hammered down on the city streets like bullets, each drop exploding against the pavement in a rhythm that matched Antoine's racing thoughts. It was nearly midnight, and the downtown area was deserted, except for the occasional taxi splashing through puddles. Antoine Carter sat behind the wheel of his silver sedan, exhausted from another grueling business meeting that had stretched well past dinner. His restaurant empire had grown to 12 locations across the state. But success came with a price. Tonight, that price was missing his daughter's bedtime again. Or so he thought. As he slowed at a red light, something caught his eye in the alley between two closed storefronts. A figure, huddled in a recessed doorway, trying to shield something from the rain. Antoine's first instinct was to look away. The city had countless homeless people, and while he donated to shelters regularly, he'd learned to maintain boundaries. But something made him look again. The way the figure moved, the curve of the shoulders, triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. The light turned green, but Antoine didn't move. Cars behind him honked, but he barely heard them. He pulled over abruptly, earning angry shouts from other drivers, and stepped out into the rain. The cold water soaked through his expensive suit immediately, but he barely noticed. As he walked closer to the alley, his heart began to pound. That coat. He recognized that burgundy coat. It had been hanging in his mudroom for 2 years before disappearing 6 months ago. The figure looked up, and Antoine's breath caught in his throat. It was Zara Santos, his former housekeeper, the woman who had kept his home running smoothly for 3 years, who knew how he liked his coffee, who had been more like family than staff, the woman who had vanished without explanation 6 months ago, leaving only a brief text message saying she had to leave immediately for personal reasons. But that wasn't what made Antoine freeze in place. It was the bundle in Zara's arms. A baby, maybe 4 or 5 months old, wrapped in layers of blankets that looked thin and inadequate against the cold. The infant was crying, a weak, exhausted sound that pierced through the rain and traffic noise. "Zara?" Antoine's voice came out hoarse, disbelieving. He took another step closer, and she shrank back against the door, clutching the baby tighter. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks hollow in a way that spoke of missed meals and sleepless nights. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hair, once always neatly tied back, hung in damp tangles around her face. This wasn't the confident, warm woman he remembered. This was someone who had been surviving, barely, on the edge of society. "Mr. Carter," she whispered, and there was shame in her voice, thick and heavy. "Please, just go. Pretend you didn't see me." She turned away, but the baby's cry grew louder, and Antoine saw her shoulders shake with what might have been a sob. Antoine moved closer, kneeling down despite the wet ground soaking through his pants. "Zara, what happened? Why are you out here? Whose baby is that?" The questions tumbled out, but even as he asked them, something nagged at him. Something about the baby's cry, the shape of her tiny face visible between the blankets. Zara shook her head, tears now mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "You should go home to your wife, Mr. Carter. Go home to Mrs. Clare. Just forget you saw me." There was bitterness in her voice when she said Claire's name, a sharp edge that Antoine had never heard before. But Antoine couldn't move. His eyes were fixed on the baby now, drawn by something he couldn't explain. "Let me see her," he said softly. "Please, Zara, let me see the baby." His voice was gentle but insistent, and after a long moment, Zara's resistance crumbled. She shifted the blankets, revealing a tiny face with the most striking blue-gray eyes Antoine had ever seen. Eyes that looked hauntingly familiar. The baby had stopped crying now, staring up at Antoine with an intensity that seemed impossible for an infant. Her little hand emerged from the blankets, fingers stretching toward him, and there, on her left wrist, was a birthmark. Not just any birthmark, but a distinctive crescent shape, like a tiny moon etched into her skin. Antoine's blood turned to ice. He knew that birthmark. He'd traced it with his fingers 1,000 times on his wife's wrist. It was a family trait on Claire's side, passed down through generations, rare and unmistakable. "No," Antoine breathed. But even as he denied it, he knew. He knew with a certainty that made his chest constrict and his vision blur. This can't be." He looked up at Zara, his eyes wild with confusion and dawning horror. "Zara, tell me the truth. Whose baby is this?" Zara's face crumpled, and she began to sob in earnest now, her whole body shaking. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't give her up. I couldn't let her go to strangers. She's yours. She's your daughter. She's Sophie." The world tilted on its axis. Antoine felt like he was falling, even though he was already kneeling on the ground. Sophie. His daughter, Sophie. The baby he'd buried 6 months ago. The child he'd mourned, whose empty casket he'd stood over with tears streaming down his face. The daughter whose death had carved a hole in his heart that never quite healed. "That's impossible," Antoine said, but his voice had no strength. "Sophie died right after birth. There were complications. Claire showed me the hospital papers. We had a funeral. His voice broke and he couldn't continue. Zara was shaking her head, clutching Sophie tighter. "She didn't die, Mr. Carter. Mrs. Clare lied to you. She lied to everyone." The words came out in a rush now, as if a dam had broken. When Sophie was born, something happened to Mrs. Clare. She wouldn't hold her, wouldn't even look at her. The nurses tried, the doctors tried, but she just kept turning away. And when they finally put Sophie in her arms, she handed her back and said, "Take her away. I can't do this." Antoine's mind was reeling, trying to process what he was hearing. He remembered those days after the birth. He'd been in California, finalizing the purchase of his 11th restaurant. Claire had gone into labor early, and by the time he got the call and caught the first flight home, it was over, or so he'd been told. He'd arrived at the hospital to find Claire sedated, and the doctors told him their daughter hadn't survived. They'd been so sorry, so professional. And Claire, when she woke, had been inconsolable. Or had she? Looking back now, Antoine realized her grief had seemed strange, distant, like she was performing emotions rather than feeling them. "Keep talking," Antoine said, his voice hard now. "Tell me everything." Zara took a shaky breath. "Mrs. Clare called me to the hospital the next day. You were making funeral arrangements. She told me she couldn't be Sophie's mother, that she'd made a terrible mistake. She said every time she looked at Sophie, all she could see was her own mother who abandoned her. She was terrified she'd do the same thing, so she thought it was better to let Sophie go right away." Zara's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "She told me to take Sophie and find her a good home. She said she'd arrange the papers, make it look like the baby died. She gave me $5,000 and made me promise never to tell anyone." Antoine felt bile rise in his throat. "And you agreed? You just took my daughter and disappeared." There was anger in his voice now, hot and righteous. No! Zara's eyes flashed with her own anger. I told her no. I told her she needed help, that you deserved to know the truth. But she threatened me. Said she'd have me arrested for kidnapping if I didn't do what she asked. Said she'd ruin my life, get me deported. Zara's voice cracked. I'm not a citizen, Mr. Carter. I have family back home depending on me. I was terrified. So you took the money and ran, Antoine said coldly. I took Sophie. Zara corrected, her voice gaining strength. I took her because I couldn't let her go to strangers. I couldn't let your daughter disappear into the system. I thought maybe I could figure something out, find a way to tell you the truth. But Mrs. Clare was watching me. She had people checking on me, so I did what she asked. I left, but I kept Sophie. I used that money to rent a small room, to buy formula and diapers and everything a baby needs. I kept thinking I'd find a way to fix this. Antoine's anger was draining away, replaced by a grief so profound it felt like drowning. What happened? Why are you on the street? Zara's shoulders sagged. The money ran out. I tried to work, but who's going to hire someone with a baby and no references? I couldn't list you because Mrs. Clare made sure I couldn't contact you. I sold everything I had. When I couldn't pay rent, we got evicted. That was 3 weeks ago. I've been trying to keep Sophie warm, trying to feed her, but... She looked down at the baby in her arms, and her expression was full of anguish. I'm failing her. I know I am, but I couldn't give her up. She's such a sweet baby, Mr. Carter. She deserves so much better than this. Antoine reached out slowly, and this time Zara didn't pull away. He touched Sophie's cheek with trembling fingers. The baby turned toward his hand, her tiny mouth making sucking motions. She was hungry. His daughter was hungry and cold, and for 6 months he'd thought she was dead. The betrayal was so enormous, so complete, that he couldn't fully grasp it. Come with me, Antoine said, standing up. Both of you, right now. His voice left no room for argument. He shrugged out of his suit jacket and wrapped it around Zara's shoulders, then scooped Sophie out of her arms before she could protest. The baby felt impossibly light, and Antoine's heart clenched. Was she underweight? Had she been sick? 1,000 fears crashed over him. Zara struggled to her feet, swaying with exhaustion. Mr. Carter, I don't think... I'm not asking, Antoine said firmly. You're coming with me. I'm taking you somewhere warm and dry. I'm getting food in both of you. And then I'm going home to have a very serious conversation with my wife. The last word came out like venom. He led Zara to his car, settling her in the back seat with Sophie. The baby had quieted, perhaps sensing the change in atmosphere. Antoine drove to the nearest upscale hotel, his mind operating on autopilot while his emotions churned like a storm. He got Zara and Sophie checked into a suite, ordered room service to bring everything they might need, and made sure they were settled. Zara tried to thank him, but he just shook his head. We'll talk more tomorrow, he said. Right now you need to rest and take care of Sophie. I need to. He couldn't finish the sentence. What did he need to do? Confront his wife, call the police, collapse under the weight of this revelation. The drive home took 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Antoine's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. His mind kept circling back to the same questions. How could Clare have done this? How could she have looked him in the eye every day for 6 months, knowing their daughter was alive? They'd grieved together. He'd held her while she cried. Or had those tears been guilt instead of grief? The house was dark when he pulled into the driveway. It was after 1 in the morning now. Clare would be asleep in their bedroom, in the bed they'd shared for 8 years. Antoine let himself in quietly, but he had no intention of being gentle. He climbed the stairs, each step fueling his rage. Clare was indeed asleep. curled on her side in a white nightgown, her blonde hair spread across the pillow. She looked peaceful, innocent. Antoine turned on the bedroom light, and she jerked awake, blinking in confusion. "Antoine, what time is it? Why are you all wet?" She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and then she seemed to register his expression. The color drained from her face. "What's wrong? Did something happen?" "Where is she?" "Claire." Antoine's voice was eerily calm, which made it all the more frightening. "Where is who? Antoine, you're scaring me." But there was something in her eyes now, a flicker of fear that had nothing to do with confusion. Antoine pulled out his phone and brought up the photo he'd taken at the hotel. Sophie, wrapped in clean blankets, sleeping peacefully. He held it up so Claire could see. "Where is our daughter? Where is Sophie?" Claire's face went from pale to gray. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Then she started shaking her head, small rapid movements like she could deny reality itself. No, that's not. You couldn't have. How did you?" The words tumbled out incoherently. "I found Zara," Antoine said, and each word was like a stone dropping into still water. "I found her on the street, homeless, with our daughter in her arms. Our daughter who's supposed to be dead, our daughter who I mourned, who I stood over a coffin for, Claire. An empty coffin." His voice was rising now, the calm facade cracking. "Tell me the truth. Right now, all of it." Claire's composure shattered completely. She began to sob, pulling her knees to her chest and rocking back and forth. "I couldn't do it," she gasped between sobs. "I couldn't be her mother. Every time I looked at her, all I saw was my mother. All I felt was terror that I'd do what she did to me. Leave, abandon, destroy." The words poured out like poison. I thought if I gave her up right away before I could hurt her, it would be better. I thought she'd have a chance with someone else. Someone who wasn't broken like me. "So you faked her death?" Antoine's voice was incredulous. "You paid off hospital staff? You made me bury an empty casket? You let me grieve for 6 months while our daughter was alive?" "I didn't know what else to do," Claire screamed, and there was genuine anguish in her voice. "I was drowning, Antoine. Every day I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't. The lie got bigger and bigger, and I couldn't find my way out. I started seeing a therapist 3 months ago, but I still couldn't admit what I'd done. I'm sick, Antoine. I know I am, but I didn't know how to fix it." Antoine stared at the woman he'd loved, the woman he'd planned to build a life with, and saw a stranger. "You let Zara become homeless," he said quietly. "You let her and our daughter sleep on the streets. Sophie could have died out there, Claire. She could have gotten sick, been hurt, been taken. And you knew, and you did nothing." "I thought Zara would give her up for adoption, like I asked," Claire whispered. "I didn't know she'd kept her. I swear I didn't know." "Does that make it better?" Antoine asked. "You wanted our daughter given to strangers. You wanted her erased from our lives, from my life." The betrayal was so complete, so total, that Antoine felt something break inside him, something that might never be repaired. Claire reached for him, but he stepped back. "Don't," he said. "Don't touch me. I can't even look at you right now. What are you going to do?" Claire's voice was small, terrified. Antoine took a deep breath. "I'm going to get my daughter. I'm going to bring her home. And you're going to check yourself into a psychiatric facility. Tonight. Because you need help, Claire. Serious help. And I need time to figure out if I can ever forgive this." "And us?" Claire asked, but she already knew the answer. "There is no us right now," Antoine said. "There's only Sophie. Everything else comes later, if it comes at all." He turned and walked out, leaving Clare sobbing behind him. The house that had been their home felt like a museum now, full of memories that had been tainted by lies. Antoine packed a bag mechanically, gathering clothes and essentials. Then he went to the nursery, the room they'd prepared for Sophie that had been closed up for 6 months. He opened the door and stood in the doorway, looking at the crib, the changing table, the stuffed animals that had never been used. Tomorrow, this room would come alive. His daughter would sleep in that crib. This wasn't the homecoming he'd imagined, but it was a second chance, a miracle wrapped in betrayal and pain. Antoine drove back to the hotel as the first light of dawn began to paint the sky pink and gold. When he entered the suite, Zara was awake, feeding Sophie from a bottle. Both of them looked better after a night of warmth and safety. Sophie's eyes tracked toward him as he entered, and something in Antoine's chest tightened. "Mr. Carter," Zara said, standing up quickly. "Just Antoine," he said. "Please. After everything, I think we're past formality." He sat down across from them, watching his daughter eat. "I spoke to Clare. She admitted everything." Zara's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry. I should have found a way to tell you sooner. I should have—" "You saved her," Antoine interrupted. "You could have given her up. You could have walked away. Instead, you gave up everything to keep her safe. You became homeless, rather than abandon my daughter." His voice thickened with emotion. "I can never repay that debt, Zara. Never." "She's an easy baby to love," Zara said softly, looking down at Sophie with unmistakable affection. "Sweet and calm. Even when things were hard, she barely cried. It's like she knew I was trying my best." Antoine watched them together and made a decision. "Come work for me again," he said. "Not as a maid, as Sophie's nanny. Live-in position, full benefits, triple what I paid you before. Help me raise her, Zara. You're the only mother she's known. I won't take that away from her." Zara's eyes widened in shock. "You'd trust me? After everything?" "You're the only one I trust right now," Antoine said honestly. "You chose her over everything. That's more than her own mother did." And so began the long road to healing. Antoine took Sophie home, and Zara came with them. The house filled with baby sounds for the first time, cries and coos and the rustle of tiny movements. Antoine learned to change diapers and warm bottles at 3 in the morning. He learned his daughter's different cries, the way she liked to be held, the songs that made her smile. Clare checked into a residential treatment facility, beginning the intensive therapy she desperately needed. Antoine visited occasionally, but always alone. He wasn't ready to expose Sophie to the woman who'd tried to erase her existence. 6 months passed, and slowly, painfully, life found a new rhythm. Sophie thrived, growing chubby and happy. Zara blossomed too, reunited with her family and secure in her position. She became more than an employee. She was Sophie's guardian angel, the woman who'd chosen love over safety. Antoine started therapy himself, working through the layers of betrayal and grief. He learned that Clare's actions, while inexcusable, had roots in deep trauma and untreated mental illness. Understanding didn't mean forgiveness, but it helped him see the complexity of what had happened. One spring afternoon, Antoine stood in the garden holding Sophie, who was now a year old and babbling happily. Zara was nearby, preparing lunch. It was a peaceful moment, ordinary and precious. Sophie reached for a butterfly dancing past, her little hand with its crescent birthmark stretching toward beauty. Clare had completed her program and was living in a supervised apartment, slowly rebuilding her life. She'd started having supervised visits with Sophie, brief meetings where she could hold her daughter and whisper apologies Sophie was too young to understand. The road to any kind of relationship was long and uncertain, but Sophie didn't need certainty. She had Antoine, who loved her with a fierce protectiveness, born of nearly losing her. She had Zara, whose sacrifice had saved her life. She had a home filled with warmth and laughter and second chances. As Antoine watched his daughter explore the world with wonder in her eyes, he thought about the night he'd found her. The rain, the darkness, the moment of recognition that had shattered his world and rebuilt it. He'd lost so much, his marriage, his trust, 6 months with his daughter. But he'd gained something too. A clarity about what mattered, an appreciation for the people who choose love, even when it costs them everything. Sophie looked up at him and smiled, her whole face lighting up, and Antoine felt tears prick his eyes. Not tears of grief this time, but of gratitude. His daughter was alive. Against all odds, through betrayal and pain, she'd survived, and so had he. The months that followed were a careful dance of healing and rebuilding. Antoine threw himself into fatherhood with an intensity that surprised even him. Every milestone Sophie reached felt like a victory snatched from the jaws of tragedy. Her first tooth, her first word, which was Dada, bringing tears to his eyes, her first wobbly steps across the living room floor. Each moment was precious because he'd almost lost the chance to witness any of them. But beneath the joy, there was still unfinished business. The legal complications alone were staggering. Antoine had contacted his lawyers immediately, and they'd spent weeks untangling the web of fraud Clare had created. The hospital staff who'd been bribed were facing consequences. The falsified death certificate had to be voided. Sophie's birth certificate had to be corrected. It was a bureaucratic nightmare that reminded Antoine daily of how deep the deception had gone. Then there were the questions from friends and family. How did he explain that his daughter, who they'd mourned, was suddenly alive? The truth was too complicated, too painful. Antoine settled on a carefully worded explanation about a mix-up at the hospital and a complicated custody situation. Most people accepted it, though he saw the confusion and speculation in their eyes. Let them wonder. Sophie's privacy mattered more than satisfying their curiosity. Zara, meanwhile, was navigating her own complicated emotions. She'd grown attached to Sophie during those desperate months on the street. In many ways, she'd been more of a mother to the child than Clare ever had. Now living in Antoine's spacious home with a comfortable salary and her own suite of rooms, she sometimes felt guilty about her good fortune. She'd send money home to her family in Honduras, more than she'd ever been able to before, and they'd cry with gratitude over video calls. But the arrangement wasn't without its challenges. Sometimes when Sophie cried, both Antoine and Zara would rush to her, then pause awkwardly, unsure of boundaries. Who had the right to comfort her first? Whose role was primary? They had to learn to work together, to communicate about feeding schedules and sleep training and whether Sophie needed to see the doctor for that little cough. "You're her father," Zara said one evening after another awkward moment where they'd both reached for Sophie simultaneously. "You make the decisions. I'm just here to help." Antoine shook his head firmly. "You're not just anything, Zara. You saved her life. You kept her alive when you had nothing. Your opinion matters. Your bond with her matters. We're doing this together." It was that mutual respect that made their unconventional arrangement work. Zara taught Antoine the little things she'd learned about Sophie, that she liked to be bounced gently when fussy, that she fell asleep faster with soft music playing, that she had a stubborn streak and would refuse food if she sensed tension in the room. Antoine, in turn, made sure Zara knew she wasn't just an employee. She had holidays, she had personal time, and she had his eternal gratitude. As for Clare, Her journey was perhaps the most difficult of all. The psychiatric facility had diagnosed her with severe postpartum psychosis, compounded by unresolved childhood trauma. The abandonment she'd suffered at her mother's hands had created such deep wounds that when faced with her own child, she'd panicked and repeated the cycle she'd sworn to break. It was a classic case of trauma response, her doctors explained, but understanding the cause didn't erase the harm she'd caused. Claire spent hours in therapy, both individual and group. She worked through her childhood, her fears, her guilt. She wrote letters to Sophie that she kept in a journal, not to send, but to process her feelings. She wrote letters to Antoine too, apologies that could never fully capture the magnitude of her betrayal. Most remained unsent, gathering in a drawer, inadequate monuments to remorse. After 4 months in the residential facility, Claire moved to outpatient care. She rented a small apartment downtown, simple and sparse, a far cry from the luxury she'd known as Antoine's wife. She got a job at a bookstore, finding peace in the quiet routine of shelving books and helping customers. It was honest work, uncomplicated, and she needed simplicity while she rebuilt herself. The supervised visits with Sophie started shortly after. Once a week, in a comfortable room at a family therapy center, Claire would sit with her daughter while a social worker observed. The first visit was excruciating. Sophie, now 8 months old, didn't recognize Claire. She fussed and reached for Antoine, who sat in the corner, his expression unreadable. "It's okay," Claire whispered, her voice breaking. "It's okay, sweet girl. You don't know me. That's my fault." She didn't try to force contact, just sat nearby, speaking softly, letting Sophie get used to her presence. It took 3 visits before Sophie would let Claire hold her, and even then, the baby's eyes kept drifting back to Antoine, checking that her father was still there. But slowly, impossibly, something began to shift. Claire proved herself consistent. She never missed a visit. She brought appropriate toys, soft books with bright pictures that Sophie loved. She learned to read her daughter's cues when she was tired or hungry or overstimulated. And gradually, Sophie began to warm to this gentle woman who sang lullabies and smiled at her with such sad, hopeful eyes. Antoine watched these visits with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to snatch Sophie away, to protect her from the woman who'd tried to erase her existence. But another part, the part that had loved Claire for 8 years, recognized genuine change. Claire wasn't the same woman who'd handed her baby to Zara with cold instructions. This Claire was broken open, vulnerable, fighting daily to become someone worthy of her daughter's trust. "How do you do it?" his friend Peter asked one evening over drinks. Peter was one of the few people who knew the whole story. "How do you let her near Sophie after what she did?" Antoine swirled his whiskey, considering. "Because Sophie deserves a chance to know her mother," he said finally. Not the mother Claire was in those first days after birth, but the mother she's working to become. And because... He paused, struggling with the words. "Because I've learned that people are complicated. What Claire did was unforgivable, but she's not evil. She was sick, she's getting help. And as angry as I am, as betrayed as I feel, I can't ignore that." "You're a better man than me," Peter said quietly. Antoine shook his head. "I'm just a father trying to do right by his daughter, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." By the time Sophie turned 1, life had settled into a new normal. The birthday party was small, just Antoine, Zara, a few close friends, and, surprisingly, Claire. The visits had progressed to the point where the social worker agreed Claire could attend, though Antoine had final say. He'd debated long and hard before agreeing, but something in Claire's eyes during the last visit had convinced him. She'd held Sophie carefully, treasuring every moment, and when the session ended, she'd kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "I love you. I'm so sorry. I'll spend my whole life trying to make this right." At the party, Claire kept to the edges, not wanting to intrude on the celebration. She'd brought a simple gift, a soft, stuffed rabbit that Sophie immediately grabbed and hugged. When it came time to cut the cake, Sophie was in her high chair, face covered in frosting, delighted by the attention. Claire watched with tears streaming down her face, and Zara, surprisingly, walked over and stood beside her. "She's a beautiful girl," Zara said softly. "Because of you," Claire replied, her voice thick. "You saved her when I couldn't. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but thank you. Thank you for loving her." Zara was quiet for a moment. "I won't lie and say I understand what happened. I don't, but I see you trying. That matters." She paused, then added, "Sophie's going to need her mother. Not right away, maybe not for a long time, but someday. So keep working, keep healing, be someone she can be proud of." It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was something. A crack in the wall, a possibility of future peace. As the party wound down and guests left, Antoine found himself alone in the kitchen with Sophie, sleeping against his shoulder. Zara was cleaning up, humming softly, and through the window he could see Clare standing by her car, head bowed, before finally driving away. This was his life now. Complicated, messy. Nothing like what he'd imagined. He'd thought he'd have a traditional family, husband, wife, child, happily ever after. Instead, he had a daughter who'd been declared dead and found alive, a wife who was now more of a stranger working toward redemption, and a former maid who'd become family through sacrifice and love. But as Sophie stirred against him, making the small, sleepy sounds that he'd come to cherish, Antoine realized something profound. Family wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about following the expected path or having all the right pieces in place. Family was about showing up, about choosing love even when it was complicated, about fighting for the people who mattered. Sophie had 3 people fighting for her now. A father who'd reclaimed her from the jaws of tragedy, a woman who'd sacrificed everything to keep her safe, and a mother working desperately to become worthy of her. It wasn't the family anyone would have chosen, but it was what they had, and somehow, impossibly, they were making it work. 2 years later, the transformation was even more remarkable. Sophie was a bright, energetic 3-year-old with her mother's blonde hair and her father's determined spirit. She called Antoine Daddy and Zara Zara in her sweet, lisping voice, and she called Claire, tentatively, carefully, Mama Claire. The visits had expanded to unsupervised time. Afternoons at the park, trips to the zoo, eventually overnight stays at Claire's apartment. Claire had continued therapy, had continued rebuilding her life, and while the relationship with Antoine would never return to what it was, they'd found a way to co-parent with respect and clear boundaries. Antoine had started dating again, carefully and slowly. Sophie came first always, but he was learning that he could honor the past while still moving toward a future. Zara had found love too. A kind man who worked at the local community center and treated Sophie like his own niece. One Sunday afternoon, all of them ended up at the same playground. It wasn't planned, but there they were. Antoine pushing Sophie on the swings while his new girlfriend read on a nearby bench. Zara and her boyfriend setting up a picnic and Claire arriving for her scheduled visit. For a moment, there was awkwardness, all these pieces of Sophie's complicated world converging. Then Sophie shouted from the swings, "Higher, Daddy! Zara, watch me! Mama Claire, did you see?" And her joy, her innocent delight in having so many people who loved her, broke through the tension. Claire caught Antoine's eye across the playground, and they shared a look of understanding. This wasn't about them anymore. It had never been about them. It was about this bright, beautiful child, who'd survived impossible circumstances and brought them all together in the strangest way possible. As the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sophie ran between her various guardians, collecting hugs and laughter. She was safe, she was loved, she was exactly where she belonged. And Antoine, watching his daughter's joy, felt the last pieces of his broken heart finally begin to heal. The journey had been brutal, the betrayal had cut deep, but on the other side of all that pain was this moment. This imperfect, complicated, beautiful moment. Sophie would grow up knowing her story. When she was old enough, they'd tell her the truth, all of it. She'd learn about the night her father found her, about Zara's sacrifice, about her mother's illness and recovery. It would be hard to hear, but she'd also learn about resilience, about second chances, about the many forms love could take. For now, though, she was simply a happy child on a playground, surrounded by people who'd move mountains to keep her safe. And that, Antoine thought as Sophie ran to him with arms outstretched, was more than enough. It was everything.